My name is Samantha Parker, and I'm 32 years old. Throughout my life, there has always been one constant, my younger sister Jessica, taking things that belonged to me. It began innocently enough when we were children. She'd steal my dolls, my favorite coloring books, even the blanket I was attached to. As we grew older, the stakes increased. She took my clothes without asking, copied my style, and even inserted herself into my friend groups. And every single time, she managed to shine brighter, talk louder, and somehow garner all the attention I had once been basking in. But nothing could have possibly prepared me for what she would take from me on the evening of my last birthday. I remember it so vividly, the warm lighting of the restaurant, the gentle hum of chatter, my family gathered around, and the smell of roasted chicken and red wine filled the air. I had just begun to make a toast, when Jessica stood abruptly, placed her hand gently on her still flat stomach, and announced that she was expecting a baby with my husband, Kyle. My heart didn't just break. It imploded. What neither of them realized in that jaw-dropping moment was that I had a revelation of my own. Something buried deep, something they never saw coming, and what I was holding back would flip their little romantic drama on its head. Let's rewind a bit. Growing up as Jessica's older sister wasn't just a role, it was a sentence. From the minute she entered the world, when I was just 4 years old, the dynamic was set in stone. She was the princess, the delicate golden child who could do no wrong. While I was handed practical clothes and sensible birthday cakes, Jessica wore frilly dresses with glittery shoes and celebrated with ponies and party clowns. Our parents didn't lack love for me, but their affection was doled out with unequal servings. I brought home straight A's and received a quick, "That's good, Sam," before they returned to fawning over Jessica's crayon scribbles, which they praised as budding artistry. My mother adored showing off her little starlet, and my father, though loving, was far more involved in coaching Jessica's softball games than attending a single one of my debate tournaments. This favoritism, subtle and persistent, etched itself into my core. Each ignored accomplishment, every overshadowed moment, built up like bricks in a wall, I tried to pretend wasn't there. But resentment quietly took root. Jessica, perhaps emboldened by her pedestal, developed an uncanny knack for wanting anything I had. My teddy bear mysteriously migrated to her room. The cardigan I saved for weeks to buy was suddenly hers. When I was cast as the lead in our school's play, she feigned interest in theater, pushing our parents to fund expensive acting lessons for her. The phrase, "Why can't you just share with your little sister," was a mantra at home, always aimed at me, never at her. By the time I graduated from high school, I was emotionally drained and ready for freedom. I chose Northwestern University, not just for its academic programs, but for the physical and emotional distance it offered. Moving 3 states away was the breath of fresh air I desperately needed. For the first time, I existed without her shadow. In college, I found my voice. I connected with people who valued me for my qualities, not in contrast to my sister's theatrics. I discovered a love for marketing and communications. And in the fall of my junior year, fate brought Kyle into my life. He breezed into my advanced marketing class with his signature messy brown hair and an awkward charm that was impossible to fake. On our first encounter, he clumsily dropped his coffee all over my notes. He was mortified, stammering out apologies, offering to replace my materials and dinner. I said yes, amused and intrigued. That dinner became a sunrise conversation. We talked for hours about books, family histories, goals, and fears. "You're the first person who gets me," he said, and in his gaze I felt deeply understood, perhaps for the first time. We were a perfect match. Kyle was smart, compassionate, and driven without being ruthless. We graduated hand in hand, moved to Chicago, and started climbing the ladders of our respective careers. 2 years later, on a calm morning by Lake Michigan, he proposed with a simple diamond ring and teary eyes. I said yes, certain that I'd finally escaped Jessica's orbit and built something that was purely mine. But weddings are about families, and that meant inviting Jessica back into the fold. At the time, she was working as a pharmaceutical sales rep, though her job seemed more centered around charm than pharmaceuticals. When I called her to share the happy news of my engagement, her reaction was telling. "Well, I guess congrats," she said with a bored tone. "Is he rich?" Those were her exact words, not, "I'm happy for you," not, "You deserve this," just a probe into his wallet. Despite every red flag, I let my mother guilt me into making Jessica my maid of honor. "She'd be crushed if you didn't include her," she said. I swallowed my hesitation and tried to believe that perhaps Jessica had matured. But at my bridal shower, she wore an ivory dress so close to white it could have passed for a wedding gown. At the rehearsal dinner, Her speech revolved entirely around her love misadventures and how difficult it must be to find someone who could put up with me. I smiled through it all, determined not to let her ruin my happiness. The wedding day was magical, at least the parts that didn't involve Jessica. She arrived late for pictures, cried hysterically during the ceremony, louder than our mom, and flirted shamelessly with Kyle's best man at the reception. Kyle reassured me, squeezing my hand and whispering, "She's just jealous, you're amazing," and I believed him. The first 2 years of marriage felt like everything I'd hoped for. We bought a modest home just outside the city, threw ourselves into our work, and talked about having kids when the timing felt right. Kyle was cautious, unsure if we were ready, and I respected that. We focused on building our lives. But then, things changed. A year ago, Kyle became distant. He stayed at work late more often. His phone, once casually left on the table, was now always face down. Passwords were suddenly updated. He grew jumpy when I glanced at his screen. The warmth between us faded. We became strangers, sharing a space. "It's just the new role, lots of pressure," he'd tell me whenever I brought it up. "Once the project wraps, things will feel normal again." But they didn't. The silence grew louder, and I became suspicious. I scanned his phone bills, saw repeated calls to a number I didn't recognize. A soft floral scent lingered on his shirts, one I didn't wear. I didn't want to believe it at first. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But every sign pointed to something deeper, something more sinister than a simple disconnect. The laughter that used to fill our home was replaced by silence. The kisses became quick pecks, and the conversations became robotic exchanges about grocery lists and bills. I was losing him, and worse, I felt like I was the only one fighting to save what we had. It was a single fine blonde strand of hair clinging to the shoulder of Kyle's navy wool jacket that first triggered my suspicions. Jessica had hair exactly that shade and length. I stood in our entryway, holding the coat with trembling fingers, staring at the golden thread as though it were a fuse ready to ignite something devastating. I told myself not to spiral, that I was being ridiculous. Jessica lived in the same city, yes, but we barely saw each other outside of family functions. What reason would Kyle have to be anywhere near her? Still, the unease lingered. As my 32nd birthday approached, I clung to the hope that it might reignite the closeness we'd lost. Kyle had been emotionally withdrawn for months now, but he promised to make the day memorable. I allowed myself to believe him. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, things could shift back to the way they were. My parents had decided to host a family dinner at Morello, a cozy bistro tucked in the historic district, my favorite restaurant since college. I spent extra time preparing that evening. I slipped into the sapphire dress Kyle once claimed made my eyes look like polished gemstones. I styled my hair in loose waves, spritzed on his favorite vanilla perfume, and even applied the plum lipstick he always said looked perfect on me. Looking at myself in the mirror, I whispered a silent mantra. Tonight will be different. Tonight will be a new beginning. I had no idea how prophetic those words would become. Merlot's warm, amber-hued lighting and rustic brick walls exuded comfort and celebration. The smell of fresh-baked bread and roasted rosemary chicken made my stomach growl softly as I entered. Kyle had texted last minute to say he'd meet me there, blaming an unavoidable work call. "Mrs. Parker," the hostess greeted me with a bright smile. "Your party's already here." She led me past clinking glasses and soft laughter to a corner table surrounded by familiar faces. My parents stood as I approached, their expressions painted in carefully balanced affection. My mom offered a tight smile, warm but reserved, as if joy was something she had to ration. My dad gave me a one-armed hug, firm and awkward. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he said, handing me a small navy gift bag. "Nothing fancy, just something your mother picked out." "You look lovely, Samantha," my mother said, patting my shoulder before leaning in. "Though you may want to touch up your lipstick before the photos." There it was, my mother's signature backhanded compliment, soft as velvet and sharp as glass. I smiled and tucked the comment into the drawer where I stored all the others. "Thanks for organizing this, Mom. It means a lot," I said sincerely. Jessica had not yet arrived, which didn't surprise me. Her lateness wasn't just habitual, it was strategic. She relished the dramatic entrance, the heads turning, the spotlight. I glanced at my phone, no update from Kyle. "He's running late," I told my parents as I took my seat. "Something came up at work." My dad nodded with understanding. "That's just the price of ambition. Your Kyle's a hard worker." The waiter arrived to take drink orders. I hesitated, still hoping to wait and toast with Kyle. "Just water for now," I said. "Have some wine, dear," my mother said with a nudge. "You're the birthday girl." Before I could respond, I heard it. the unmistakable trill of Jessica's laughter slicing through the restaurant like a blade. Heads turned, she walked in with the effortless poise of someone who always knew eyes would follow her. She wore a skin-tight crimson dress, her long blonde curls cascading over one shoulder. Her heels clicked assertively on the tile floor. But what made my breath hitch wasn't her outfit. It was her companion. My husband was with her. He held the door for her with practiced ease, his hand hovering too long on the small of her back as they stepped inside. They walked side by side, too close, smiling with the kind of warmth usually reserved for something far more intimate than family ties. "Sorry we're late," Jessica sang, leaning down to brush a kiss against my cheek. She left no lipstick mark, as if practiced deception. "I bumped into Kyle in the parking lot. Total coincidence." Her voice was honeyed and hollow. Kyle slid into the seat beside me, his arm brushing mine. "Happy birthday, Sam," he said, squeezing my shoulder briefly. "Sorry about the delay." He smelled freshly showered, his cologne more intense than usual, the scent wrapping around me like a thick cloud of deceit. I forced a smile. "No problem. I'm glad everyone's here now." We placed our orders, but I could barely concentrate on the menu. My parents took over the conversation with stories about their recent cruise and amusing complaints about their neighbors' bizarre lawn ornaments. Jessica, never one to be sidelined, peppered the evening with stories of glamorous industry mixers and celebrity encounters, most of which I doubted were real. Kyle, meanwhile, was uncharacteristically silent. He only chimed in when prompted and kept his gaze mostly on his plate. I reached under the table, placing my hand gently on his knee. He tensed, then covered my hand with his own. His palm was slick with sweat. "Everything okay?" I asked, quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he answered, too fast, "just tired." When it was time for gifts, the emotional distance became undeniable. My parents gave me a department store gift card, practical, impersonal. Kyle handed me a velvet box. Inside were diamond studs, expensive but generic. They didn't reflect my style at all, and I suspected he had bought them on his lunch break that day. Jessica's gift was a silk designer scarf in an unflattering burnt orange tone. "It's exactly your color," she gushed. I nodded, knowing full well she had probably purchased it for herself before deciding to rewrap it. The dessert arrived, the molten chocolate lava cake I had specially requested. The waiter placed it in front of me with a flourish as my dad raised his wineglass for a toast. "To my daughter Samantha, on her birthday. You've always been the responsible one. Your mother and I are proud of the stable life you've built." Stable. Not brilliant, not passionate, just stable, like a dependable car or a durable washing machine. Something that runs well, never draws attention, and is quietly useful. The words sat on my chest like a weight, and for the first time that night I understood exactly what my role had always been: to be the fallback, the support beam in a house built for others to shine, and the ones who were supposed to love me the most didn't even realize they had reduced me to something that didn't even spark. I looked around the table, at my parents sipping wine, at Jessica glowing under the dim lights, at Kyle with guilt etched into his silence, and something inside me shifted. I smiled, wide and serene, and raised my glass. "To stability," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. "And what happens when the ground stops holding steady?" As the waiter approached with my dessert, the room seemed to still for a moment. He gently lit the lone candle atop the molten chocolate cake, and a soft cheer of anticipation rippled through the table. But then I saw it. Jessica, shifting eagerly in her seat, her eyes darting between me and Kyle. They exchanged a glance, one so loaded with silent communication that it turned my stomach. A cold dread curled in my gut. "Actually," Jessica chirped before anyone could begin singing. She smiled broadly, standing with an air of self-importance. "I have an announcement, and I think it would be the perfect way to make Sam's birthday even more memorable." Every face turned toward her in expectation. I felt my shoulders tighten. She placed a hand on her stomach with deliberate poise and smoothed the fabric of her crimson dress. "I wasn't going to say anything just yet, but since we're all gathered," she said, milking the moment. Then her eyes locked with mine, sharp and gleaming with victorious malice. "I'm pregnant." The words fell like lead onto the table. For a second, no one moved. The silence was cavernous, stretching and echoing. Then my mother gasped, a sound of joy, not shock, and my father broke into a grin, wider than any he'd ever offered me. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother exclaimed, already halfway into a flurry of questions. "When are you due? Are you feeling okay? How far along?" Jessica rested her hand protectively over her belly. "About 10 weeks. But then she added, her tone shifting into something cold and triumphant, "There's more." My body went rigid. She didn't make us wait long. "Kyle is the father." A collective breath escaped the table. The atmosphere turned electric with disbelief. Time slowed. My father's wineglass hovered in the air, forgotten. My mother's smile faltered as her eyes scanned our faces, flicking between Jessica, Kyle, and me, confusion replacing celebration. Kyle stared at the table, as if it held the answers, his complexion pale and waxy. "This wasn't how we were supposed to tell you," Kyle muttered, still not looking at me. I heard the word "we" and felt it land like a slap across my face. Jessica placed her manicured hand over his in a grotesque display of unity. "We were going to wait until the first trimester passed," she explained with false sincerity, "but I just couldn't hold it in." She turned her eyes to mine again, her voice syrupy and cruel. "We're a family now, Sam. Kyle and I are going to raise this baby together." It wasn't just the announcement that stunned me. It was the strategy, the theatricality of it. She had chosen this moment. My birthday, at my favorite restaurant, surrounded by our family. Not by accident, but with meticulous planning. This wasn't a confession, it was a public performance designed for devastation. My mother found her voice, a shaky whisper. "I don't understand. Kyle is Samantha's husband." She said it as though the relationship were a footnote that had been accidentally overlooked. Jessica didn't even blink. "Not for much longer," she said, waving her hand like she was dismissing a waitress. "They've had problems for a while. Kyle and I didn't plan this. It just happened. You can't stop real love when it finds you." Real love. As though what Kyle and I had built over 7 years, through graduate degrees, first jobs, shared apartments, and long nights of planning a future, was somehow fabricated. A convenient illusion next to whatever fantasy she and Kyle were now peddling. Kyle finally looked up, and the look on his face was unbearable, a mix of shame and relief, as if confessing unburdened him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never wanted you to find out this way." Jessica touched his arm and leaned closer. "Remember your Christmas party?" she asked me, her tone mockingly sweet. "You thought Kyle was helping me find my lost earring in the guest room? That's when it started." She laughed, a tinkling, deliberate sound. "He found something, all right. 6 months. While I was planning anniversary dinners, writing little notes to rekindle our romance, hoping we'd start a family, my husband and my sister were sneaking around, building one of their own." I stared at them both, unable to reconcile the people before me with the ones I had loved. My father set down his wineglass with exaggerated care. "I think," he said slowly, "this might be better discussed privately." But Jessica wasn't done. "There's no need for secrets," she said brightly. "We're all family, right?" She rested both hands on her abdomen. "And soon there'll be one more Henderson joining the table. Isn't that exciting?" My mother predictably clung to the prospect like a life raft. "A grandchild," she whispered, her expression softening into something dangerously close to joy. "The situation is complicated, but a baby is always a blessing." Of course, Jessica, once again, is being excused, forgiven, and exalted. I felt my world slipping further away. Kyle reached toward me tentatively. "Sam, can we please talk somewhere?" I looked at his hand. The same hand that had slipped a wedding ring onto mine had held me through funerals, had written me notes in our early dating days. That hand had touched her, too. "I need the restroom," I said, pushing my chair back sharply. The screech of the legs against the tile turned heads, but no one followed me. I stumbled to the bathroom, heart pounding so loudly it muffled my thoughts. Inside the dimly lit restroom, I locked myself into the farthest stall and pressed my forehead to the cool metal door. I waited for the tears, for the shaking sobs. But they never came. Instead, I felt still, hollow and clear all at once. The betrayal, though monstrous, wasn't shocking. Jessica had taken from me my entire life. And Kyle? He had been retreating from me for months. The signs were there. I had just refused to believe them. Now the truth sat before me, unmistakable and raw. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. I straightened slowly, my reflection in the scratched metal dispenser revealing a face I barely recognized. Composed, unsmiling, but no longer confused. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about years of being dismissed, overlooked, and replaced. Jessica might have Kyle now, but I wasn't going to let either of them think they had destroyed me. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me more dangerous than either of them could possibly imagine. When I emerged from the restroom, I wasn't broken. My heels clicked with purpose as I walked back to the table, each step solid, grounded. Jessica was still glowing, Kyle still avoiding my gaze, my mother still asking questions about nursery colors. No one noticed how different I was now, but they would. Soon they all would. Because if this night had taught me anything, it was this. I was done being the one who absorbed the blow. It was my turn to strike back. For the first time, I saw clearly through the fog of hurt and confusion. I understood that survival wasn't enough. I deserved more than stability. I deserved respect, joy, and truth. And I wouldn't sit quietly while others rewrote my story. Let them think they'd won tonight. Let them believe I would fade into the background like always. They'd made their declarations under the illusion that I was powerless. But I had something stronger than their betrayal. Clarity. And with clarity comes a fire that can't be extinguished. This wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the culmination of years of tension, betrayal, and patterns I had long tried to overlook. As I stood in the dim bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, letting it drip down my cheeks and pool in the basin. My eyes met their reflection in the mirror, and I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her gaze was steadier, more resolute. Harder, yes, but forged from pain, not broken by it. I reapplied my lipstick with careful, deliberate movements, watching each stroke redefine the face of someone who would not be brought to her knees. "You will not break," I whispered to myself. "Not here. Not for them." When I walked back into the dining room, they were deep in a grotesque charade, discussing baby names, as though my entire life hadn't just been set on fire. Jessica was glowing, her hand resting theatrically on her abdomen, tossing out suggestions like a contestant in a pageant. "If it's a boy, I'm thinking Kyle Jr., she said with a coy smile. "Or maybe Henderson. Has a strong ring to it, doesn't it?" Henderson. My married name. She was already claiming it, weaving it into the identity of a child that shouldn't even exist. "Or for a girl, maybe Kylie," she added with a laugh, brushing her fingers along Kyle's sleeve. "Too on the nose?" I slid back into my seat, feeling every pair of eyes turn to me. My parents looked equal parts mortified and fascinated. Kyle wore an expression of strained neutrality, while Jessica radiated anticipation. She was expecting a scene, a meltdown, a shattered wife unraveling in public. She wanted to play the part of the composed new partner, stepping in to pick up the pieces. Instead, I smiled. "You've certainly given me a birthday to remember," I said, smoothly folding my napkin across my lap. "But, if you don't mind, I'd like to enjoy my cake before it completely melts." Jessica's carefully crafted smirk wavered. This wasn't the narrative she had prepared for. Kyle blinked, visibly confused by my composure. "Sam," he began cautiously, "we should probably start talking about arrangements." All of which he passed in a moment of embrace to stop him gently to stop him. "Not now, Kyle. Right now, I'm going to have my birthday cake." I picked up my fork, cut a precise piece of the lava cake, and brought it to my mouth. The rich chocolate melted on my tongue, bittersweet and perfect. I closed my eyes for a moment, savoring the taste. When I opened them, I saw their expressions. Puzzled, expectant, wary. "What?" I asked, my tone light. "Did you think I'd scream, run out crying, cause a scene in front of the waiter?" I laughed softly. "Sorry to disappoint." Jessica's voice cut in, brittle at the edges. "We just thought you'd be more upset." "Oh, I am," I replied evenly, taking another bite. "But unlike some people, I don't feel the need to turn every emotion into theater." I placed my fork down gently and folded my hands. "In fact, before we continue this little family discussion, there's something I think you all should know." My hands trembled slightly, the only outward signal of the chaos surging inside me. I took a sip of water, buying a moment to collect my thoughts. "For the last few months," I said calmly, "I've been piecing together something I didn't want to believe, but tonight, well, it all makes sense now." Kyle shifted beside me. Jessica froze, her smile faltering. "I've known about the affair for 3 months," I said quietly. Kyle's head snapped toward me, eyes wide. Jessica's lips parted in a wordless gasp. "You should really update your passwords more often," I continued. "Using our anniversary as your email code? A bit cliché, especially once you started hiding your phone." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Samantha," she whispered, "is this the time? Is it more inappropriate than announcing an affair at your daughter's birthday dinner?" I shot back, steel in my tone. "Because that's what started this evening." I turned my attention back to Jessica. "Back in March, my laptop died right before a client presentation. I borrowed Kyle's, thinking nothing of it. But then, A notification popped up. An email from you. Subject line, last night. I watched her face blanch as I continued. I hesitated, I did. But instinct overrode principle, and I opened it. The contents were detailed. Your little rendezvous in Kyle's office. Mentions of other nights. It was explicit. Kyle's face turned a shade of gray. My father sat silently, staring into the distance, as if hoping this conversation might evaporate. I didn't confront you then, I said. I needed time, so I hired a private investigator. Davis and Associates. They're very discreet and very thorough. Jessica paled, her hand instinctively covering the bracelet on her wrist. They documented 27 separate evenings where you entered Jessica's building, Kyle. They recorded phone calls. They photographed you at that little jewelry boutique in River North, where you bought that bracelet Jessica claimed was from a grateful client. Kyle's voice rose with sudden anger. You've been spying on me. No, I said, laughing bitterly. I've been protecting myself. There's a difference. I leaned forward slightly. Adultery is still a legal ground for divorce in this state, Kyle, just in case you forgot. My father shifted, clearing his throat. Maybe we could… I'm not finished, I interrupted. 2 months ago, I contacted Patricia Donovan. She's one of the best divorce attorneys in Chicago. The papers are drawn up, the assets are cataloged, our accounts are documented. I've been meticulous. Kyle stared at me, mouth slightly open. Jessica blinked rapidly, finally realizing she was not the architect of this night. She had walked into a carefully laid trap. You've been planning this? Kyle asked, his voice dry. Yes, I said simply. I was going to wait until next week, but I suppose this little announcement made it easier. My mother's eyes welled up. Samantha, divorce is such a big decision. Surely there's room for… No, I replied. There's no room for therapy, for forgiveness, for compromise. You don't come back from this. Jessica finally spoke again, but the arrogance had faded from her voice. Sam, I know this looks bad. Bad, I laughed again, sharper this time. This isn't a misunderstanding, Jessica. You've spent months sleeping with my husband and plotting to replace me. You timed this reveal to humiliate me, and now you want to rewrite the story as if you're the victim? She looked around the table, seeking sympathy, but found only stunned silence. Even my father, usually mild and diplomatic, avoided her gaze. Kyle finally put his hands on the table. What happens now? I looked at him, and for the first time I saw someone small, someone spineless. What happens now is simple, I said. You'll be served divorce papers this week. You'll respond through your attorney, and after that I won't be speaking to either of you again, outside of legal necessity. Jessica opened her mouth, but I cut her off. You can name the baby whatever you want. Give them my last name, give them yours. But don't expect me to be part of their life. You've both forfeited that right. A heavy silence fell again, thicker than before. I stood, smoothed my dress, and placed my napkin on the table. Thank you all for dinner, I said calmly. It was certainly unforgettable. And with that, I walked out of the restaurant. This time, I didn't feel shaky or scared. I felt like someone who had just burned a bridge behind her, and didn't plan to look back. Mom, I said, my voice calm but unyielding. There's no coming back from this. And before we wrap this delightful evening, there's one more thing everyone at this table needs to know. I turned my gaze directly toward Jessica, whose smug veneer had already begun to crack. Something that makes your little announcement especially interesting. I reached for my purse, pulling out a folded document that had traveled with me for weeks. I had carried it everywhere, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the final domino. Never did I imagine it would come at my own birthday dinner. I smoothed the paper flat and slid it across the table toward Kyle. Kyle had a vasectomy 2 years ago, I said, watching as the color drained from Jessica's face. We made a decision. He didn't want kids, said the responsibility would get in the way of his career, and I, foolishly, agreed to stand by him. Jessica's expression contorted as she blinked rapidly. That's not possible, she whispered, eyes flicking between me and the paper now resting in front of her lover. You're lying. Am I replied, tilting my head. Check the paperwork. Her hands trembled as she flipped it open. Sacred Heart Medical Center. Dr. Reynolds. Vasectomy performed 26 months ago, I recited, like a eulogy. I remember it clearly. Kyle lay on our couch for 3 days, binge-watching March Madness, while I fetched him frozen peas. Kyle's face turned a ghastly shade of pale. Sam, he started, but Jessica interrupted. You had a vasectomy and didn't tell me? She asked, her voice rising sharply. You let me believe? She froze mid-sentence, as if suddenly realizing how much she was revealing in front of our entire family. My mother, hands shaking, picked up the document and scanned it silently. "Is this true, Kyle?" she asked in a hushed tone. Kyle's silence said everything. I turned back to Jessica, her face drained of color. "So, dear sister," I said, my voice edged with ice, "if you're truly pregnant, congratulations are in order, just not for Kyle. He's shooting blanks, as they say." I leaned back, folding my arms. "So, who's the real father, Jess? Do you even know?" Gasps echoed softly from nearby tables. Though they tried not to stare, the diners around us were undeniably engrossed in the real-life soap opera unfolding before them. Jessica's gaze darted wildly, desperate for an escape. "This is a mistake," she said weakly. "Those medical records must be wrong." "They're not wrong," Kyle finally admitted, eyes fixed on his trembling hands. "I should have told you, Jess. I didn't think it mattered. We were using protection, or at least we were supposed to." "You never thought she'd try to trap you with a pregnancy that couldn't possibly be yours," I finished coldly. "Rookie mistake, Kyle. You forgot who you were dealing with." Jessica abruptly stood, her chair screeching across the floor. "I need some air," she muttered, grabbing her purse and nearly stumbling toward the exit. Kyle looked torn, eyes flicking between me and Jessica's retreating form. "Go," I said, the word cold and flat. "Follow her. You two deserve each other." After a beat of hesitation, Kyle rose and followed her out, leaving me alone with my parents and the wreckage of my birthday dinner. My father cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Samantha, I don't know what to say." "There's nothing to say, Dad," I replied, reaching for my fork again. I cut another piece of cake and lifted it to my mouth. It tasted like ash, but I forced it down anyway. I wasn't going to let either of them take this from me. "Except," I added casually, "Jessica might want to book a different kind of appointment soon. One that can help her figure out who the actual father is." My mother's mascara had begun to streak down her cheeks. "How can you be so calm?" she asked through her tears. "This is a disaster." "No, Mom," I said, leveling my gaze with hers. "A disaster is something unexpected and unavoidable. This was predictable and preventable. Jessica has been taking what's mine since we were kids. You and Dad let her. But this time, I came prepared." I flagged down the waiter. "We'll take the check," I said, my tone polite but final. The restaurant had grown almost silent. The performance was over, but no one around us had turned away. I signed the check with steady hands and added a generous tip for the waiter, who had served through the most dramatic dinner of his career. As I was placing the pen down, Kyle returned alone, his face ashen. He slid into his seat, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture that once melted my heart. "Where's Jessica?" my mother asked, voice cracking. "In her car," Kyle replied. "She's upset." "I imagine finding out you're not the father of her convenient pregnancy would be upsetting," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Kyle looked at me, his eyes searching. "Sam, please, can we talk? Just you and me?" Before I could answer, my father interjected. "Is it true?" His tone was low but firm. "About the vasectomy?" Kyle gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Yes, sir. It was 2 years ago. Sam and we talked about it." "You decided," I corrected. "You were the one who didn't want kids. I was willing to wait." Kyle hesitated. "It felt mutual at the time. I should have told Jessica, but everything between us was complicated." I laughed bitterly. "That's certainly one word for sleeping with your wife's sister." My mother clutched the pearl necklace at her throat as though it could anchor her in this storm. "I don't understand how this happened," she whispered. "How could you both do this to Samantha?" Before anyone could respond, Jessica returned, her face puffy and red, but her posture stiff with rehearsed contrition. She slid into her chair without meeting anyone's eyes. "I'm sorry for running out," she said, her voice flat. "I just needed a minute." The waiter returned, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. "Is everything all right with your meal? Would anyone like coffee or dessert?" "Just the check," I replied. "It's already been signed." "Wait," Jessica said suddenly. "I want to explain." She looked around the table, finally settling her eyes on me. "Sam, what happened between Kyle and me wasn't planned." Her voice trembled, but I saw through it, just another performance. "It just happened," she continued. "We were spending time together, talking about you, and—" I raised a hand, silencing her. "Stop." Jessica's mouth snapped shut. "You don't get to rewrite this as a tragic love story," I said. You don't get to turn betrayal into fate. You had a choice. You both did. And you made it. You don't get to mourn what you destroyed. She looked like she wanted to argue, but the fight had left her. Whatever fantasy she'd spun in her mind about how this night would go had shattered, and I had no intention of helping her piece it back together. You made your bed, I said finally, and it's not with my family, not anymore. With that I stood once more, picked up my purse and looked around the table. Thank you for dinner, I said, meeting each of their eyes. But I'm done playing this role. Then I walked out, heels echoing against the floor, past diners pretending not to stare, past the ashes of a life I once believed was secure, and into something far more honest. My future. On my terms. We never meant to hurt you, Jessica insisted, her voice laced with guilt. And yet, I interjected coldly, you chose to drop the news at my birthday dinner, in front of our entire family, as if you were delivering a toast, not detonating a bomb. The silence that followed was thick and charged. Jessica, to her credit, looked ashamed. That was wrong, she admitted quietly. I thought it would be easier, with everyone around. I didn't think about how it would make you feel. That's always the case, Jess, I replied, my voice lowering. You never think about how I feel, not once. That's the real problem. You've never hesitated to take something from me, regardless of the damage it caused. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. Kyle isn't something you own, Samantha. He's not your property. That was my husband, I said sharply. The man who vowed to love me, stay loyal to me, and grow old with me. And you were my sister. Someone who should have honored that bond, even when he didn't. There was a pause before my father cleared his throat, clearly eager to redirect the rapidly devolving conversation. About the baby, he said, carefully. Jessica, if Kyle isn't the father. Jessica's eyes shimmered again, fresh tears rising. I don't know, she whispered. I thought the timing lined up. I was sure he was the father. I never imagined. My mother leaned forward, her voice barely audible. Is there someone else? Jessica nodded slowly, staring at her lap. There was someone before Kyle, she admitted. He's married too. It ended before things got serious with Kyle. Or, at least I thought it did. My father buried his face in his hands with a groan. Jessica? Dear God. I ended it, Jessica said hastily, as soon as Kyle and I got closer. But the timing, I must have miscalculated. A laugh burst from my lips, bitter and involuntary. Let me make sure I've got this right. You were involved with a married man. Then you started sleeping with my husband, your sister's husband, and got pregnant. You assumed the baby was Kyle's, then told everyone, including him, it was his. And now it turns out, it might not be. Jessica didn't respond, but even she seemed to recognize how grotesquely tangled her actions had become. It wasn't like that, she muttered. I really believed Kyle was the father. Well, he's not, I said, each word deliberate. So now you have a decision to make, about the truth. Suddenly Kyle, who had been eerily silent for much of the exchange, spoke. His voice was low but firm. I think I have some decisions to make too. He turned toward Jessica. You told me I was the only one. It had been months since you were with anyone else. Jessica reached for his hand. Kyle, please, I made a mistake, but what we had, what we still have, it's real. He yanked his hand away, recoiling like her touch burned him. Is it? He asked, his eyes fixed on hers. Or am I just another thing you took from your sister because you couldn't stand not being at the center of everything? Jessica paled, her mouth parting in silent protest. The weight of Kyle's words hung heavily over the table, impossible to ignore. My mother, clinging to her default mode of conflict resolution, stepped in. Perhaps we all need some time. This is a lot to take in. A lot, my father muttered. This is an earthquake. I stood, adjusting my dress and smoothing the fabric. I think that's a good idea, I said. Kyle, I'll have my attorney reach out next week. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you found somewhere else to stay. Kyle looked up at me, desperation etched into every line of his face. Sam, please, can't we at least talk, just the two of us? My voice didn't waver. We're well past talking, Kyle. You made your choice months ago. You just lacked the courage to tell me to my face. I turned to my parents. Thank you for the birthday dinner, I said. It was certainly one I won't forget. As I gathered my purse, Jessica's voice rang out. Samantha, wait. You can't just walk away like this. I paused, turned, and really looked at her. For the first time, I saw her not as the glamorous younger sister who always took the spotlight, but as a deeply insecure woman, desperate for attention, even at the cost of others' happiness. "I'm not walking away from something, Jess," I said gently. "I'm walking towards something better. I hope you figure out your next steps, especially about the baby's real father. But that's no longer my concern." The air outside was crisp as I stepped into the parking lot, and the night sky stretched above me like a blanket I hadn't noticed in weeks. I took a deep breath, letting the coolness fill my lungs and calm the burn in my chest. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text from Kyle. "Please come home. We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long second before deleting the message. There was nothing left to say. Whatever we had was buried under months of lies and a mountain of broken trust. Instead of going home, I checked into a hotel downtown. The front desk clerk didn't ask why I needed a room last minute on a weeknight, and I was grateful. The room was anonymous, sterile even, but it offered silence and a sense of control. The bed was too soft, the air conditioning is too loud. Still, it felt more like safety than the home I'd left behind. In the morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, ignoring the sea of missed calls and unread messages. There were 27 from Kyle, 11 from Jessica, and more than a dozen from my parents. I ignored them all and dialed Patricia Donovan. "It's time," I told her the moment she picked up. "I want to file." Patricia didn't miss a beat. "Understood. Can you come in at 11? Yeah. That meeting, brief and clinical, marked the beginning of a different kind of journey, one rooted in rebuilding. Patricia walked me through the process calmly, efficiently. I'd already prepared much of the documentation. All that remained now was executing the exit strategy. Over the next few days, my life split into two distinct modes: public composure and private unraveling. In public, I was every bit the poised professional, showing up to work, fielding emails, delivering presentations. In private, I cried in the shower. I reread Kyle's old love letters. I walked past our favorite cafe and paused too long outside the window. But I didn't text him back, not once. His messages became more frequent. "Jessica meant nothing. I love you. It was a mistake. We can fix this." Fix? There was no fixing something built on betrayal. Jessica's messages started to shift too. They began as excuses. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was just loneliness." Then transitioned into guilt. "I've ruined everything. I'm so sorry," before finally morphing into silence. And in the stillness, I found clarity. I met with a realtor to prepare the house for sale. I boxed up our shared possessions, separating what was mine from what I no longer wanted. I gave away the kitchen appliances we'd picked out together. I donated the clothes he'd gifted me. I changed my phone number. The new number was like shedding skin, stripping away the layer of me that had tolerated betrayal disguised as compromise. Compromise is... Late one evening, after a long day of meetings, I returned to the hotel room, poured myself a glass of wine, and stood by the window overlooking the city skyline. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a victim of my circumstances. I felt like a woman reclaiming her life. The story Jessica and Kyle tried to script for me had fallen apart, but the one I was writing now? It was mine, and no one could take it away. If she had truly meant nothing, he wouldn't have thrown away everything we built. That single truth echoed in my mind in the days that followed the birthday dinner. 3 days after the catastrophe, I returned to our house, but not to reconcile. I went while Kyle was at work, bringing 2 close friends and a moving company with me. I wasn't there to argue or explain. I was there to reclaim what was mine and only mine. I took my clothes, my personal items, the photo albums from my childhood, and the few pieces of furniture that had belonged to me before our marriage. I left everything else behind. I wasn't interested in splitting hairs over who paid for the blender or the guest room mirror. None of it mattered anymore. On the nightstand in our, now his, bedroom, I left his wedding ring neatly nestled on a folded note that read simply, "Patricia will contact you regarding the rest." My friend Megan offered me her guest room without hesitation. "Stay as long as you need," she said, gently placing her hand on mine as we unpacked what remained of my life. The spare room wasn't much, just a small bed, a dresser, and a window that faced a brick wall. But it was a haven, and right now, that was more than enough. As we hung my clothes in her modest closet, Megan shook her head in disbelief. "I still can't believe Jessica would do this. I mean, siblings can be competitive, sure, but this is on another level." "Jessica's been playing a one-sided game her entire life," I said, carefully folding a sweater. "She always wanted what I had. And the saddest part? Even when she wins, she still loses." Now she was pregnant with another married man's child, and Kyle, her supposed soulmate, was already showing his true colors. Those colors became even more vivid when he found out I'd moved out. That same evening, he showed up at Megan's apartment uninvited, banging on the door like a man possessed. "Sam, please," he called from the hallway. "Just talk to me. We can work this out." Megan stood beside me with her phone in hand, thumb hovering over the screen. "Want me to call the police?" I shook my head. "He'll leave eventually." Kyle kept pleading at the door until one of the neighbors threatened to call the building manager. Only then did he retreat, but not before shouting, "This isn't fair. You didn't even give me a chance to explain." That night, my phone rang, Jessica's name flashing across the screen. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Sam," she said, her voice small and frail. "Can we talk?" "I think we've said everything that needs saying," I replied, already regretting the decision to answer. "Please," she whispered. "I need my sister." The audacity was stunning. "You needed your sister when you chose to sleep with your husband," I said flatly. "It's a little late now." "I know what I did was unforgivable," her voice cracked. "But I'm scared, Sam. I'm pregnant with a married man's baby, and now Kyle won't return my calls either." A tiny part of me felt a pang, a ghost of compassion for the little girl she once was, always needing more love, more attention, more everything. But empathy could no longer eclipse the reality of the wreckage she'd caused. "What did you expect, Jess? That he'd leave me and ride off into the sunset with you?" "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I didn't think that far ahead. I just wanted what you had. I always have." "Well, now neither of us has it," I said, letting the words hang. "I hope it was worth it." After hanging up, I sat on the edge of Megan's guest bed, letting the silence wash over me. I grieved. Not just the collapse of my marriage, but the final, irreparable fracture in a sisterhood that had never truly existed. The following day, my parents called. My mother, ever in denial, floated the idea of family counseling. "Your sister made a mistake, Samantha," she said, as though Jessica had dented the car, not detonated my marriage. "She's still family. She's going to need our support, especially with this baby." "Then you support her," I replied. "I'm done being her safety net." To my surprise, my father understood. "You're right to be angry," he said. "What they did was inexcusable. Just don't let it poison your future." "I won't," I promised. "That's why I'm moving on." Exactly 1 week after my birthday, Kyle's tone shifted from pleading to bitter. "You won't even talk to me," he texted, "but you had time to freeze our joint accounts. Real mature, Sam." I forwarded the message to Patricia without replying. Let her handle it. Jessica, meanwhile, had apparently confessed the pregnancy to the other married man. According to my mother, he'd denied paternity and threatened to expose her to his wife if she pursued it further. "She's all alone now," my mother said during another unwanted call. "Surely you can find some compassion." "My compassion," I said, "is currently busy helping me heal." 2 weeks after my birthday, I signed the lease on a new apartment. It was a 1-bedroom loft in a lively neighborhood I'd always admired. Trendy, vibrant, and everything Kyle used to sneer at. I bought new furniture, painted the walls sage green, a color he hated, and started crafting a space that felt entirely and unapologetically mine. Patricia called with updates. Kyle was contesting the division of assets, despite the prenuptial agreement he had willingly signed. "It's a delay tactic," she explained. "He's hoping to drag this out and force you into mediation, where he can manipulate the outcome." "I've become immune to his emotional leverage," I assured her. "Proceed exactly as planned." At work, I immersed myself in every project I could find. I stayed late, volunteered for travel, and channeled all the energy I used to spend saving my marriage into building a life I could be proud of. My coworkers respected my silence, with one notable exception, David from Creative. Every few days he left a coffee on my desk with a sticky note. "Hang in there, or their loss." It wasn't a flirtation, it was kindness, simple and clean. 3 weeks after my birthday, Jessica showed up unannounced at my new apartment. I didn't know how she found my address. Her eyes were puffy, makeup smudged, and clothes wrinkled. "Kyle's been sleeping with someone else," she announced as I opened the door. "Some woman from his office. Can you believe it?" The irony was so dense, I could almost taste it. "Yes, Jessica," I said, deadpan. "I absolutely can believe that the man who cheated with you would cheat on you." "That's generally how it works," I said quietly, watching her fold her arms over her stomach as if trying to shield herself from the weight of her own decisions. "I thought we were different," Jessica murmured, her voice brittle. "I thought he really loved me." Leaning against the doorway, I felt the exhaustion settle into my bones, not from the chaos of recent weeks, but from the predictability of it all. Jessica made reckless choices, stumbled into disaster, and then looked to the rest of us to help her recover. The cycle was exhausting, and I was done spinning in it. "What exactly do you want from me, Jess?" I asked, my voice stripped of malice, just bone-deep fatigue. "Do you want comfort, advice, a place to stay until your next catastrophe?" Her face crumpled. "I just want my sister back. I know I don't deserve it, but I miss you, Sam. I'm sorry, I really am." For a moment I wavered. She was my sister, my only sibling, the girl who once shared my bed when she was afraid of thunderstorms, who used to sneak into my room to borrow makeup and leave glitter everywhere. Our history was flawed, but it was real. "I'm not ready to forgive you," I said at last. "Maybe someday, but not now. Right now I need space. I need to heal." Jessica nodded, tears escaping down her cheeks. "I understand. But when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." As she turned and walked away, I felt something shift inside me. Yes, there was still anger and sadness, but layered beneath it was a new sensation: freedom. For the first time in our relationship, I had set the terms. I had drawn a line that protected me, instead of constantly making space for her chaos. Weeks after my birthday, I received the final set of divorce papers Kyle had signed. Patricia called to confirm everything had been accepted and finalized. "It's almost never this clean," she said, sounding mildly impressed. "Usually there's more fighting, more drama." "Oh, there's been plenty of drama," I assured her with a wry smile, "just not the legal kind." That night, I opened a bottle of wine and stepped out onto the small balcony of my apartment. The city lights glittered, indifferent to my heartbreak but somehow comforting in their consistency. My phone pinged. A message from David. "Some of us are grabbing drinks after work tomorrow. No pressure, but you're always welcome to join." I stared at it for a long moment before replying, "Thanks. I might do that." It wasn't a promise, just a gentle acknowledgement that life still moved forward, that maybe, just maybe, there were good things ahead I couldn't yet picture. Sipping my wine, I thought of everything Kyle and Jessica had taken from me: my marriage, my sense of safety, and the illusion that family could always be trusted. But they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my dignity, my resilience, my ability to rebuild. And most importantly, they hadn't taken my right to define my own life. The pain lingered, yes. The betrayal still stung, and the loss still throbbed like an old bruise. But under that ache, something new had begun to stir, like the first stubborn green shoots after a fire scorches the earth. 1 year after that birthday dinner that changed everything, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment. It was no longer new. It was mine. The walls bore marks from furniture rearranged during cleaning sprees, and the couch had a permanent dent from my reading nook. The woman staring back at me was familiar but altered. She had been through something and come out on the other side. Scarred, yes, but stronger. 6 months earlier, the divorce had been finalized. Kyle, recognizing the overwhelming evidence Patricia had gathered, agreed to the asset division outlined in our prenuptial agreement. I retained full ownership of my pre-marriage investment portfolio, half the equity from our house, and all of my retirement accounts. He kept his shares in the business and his guilt. Jessica had given birth to a baby boy 3 months ago. She named him Leo. The DNA test, unsurprisingly, confirmed that Kyle was not the father. The real father was Richard, a pharmaceutical executive Jessica had met through her job. He eventually left his wife and moved in with Jessica after Leo was born. Whether their relationship would last remained uncertain, but to Jessica's credit, she seemed genuinely invested in motherhood in a way that took me by surprise. My relationship with Jessica was still delicate, still tinged with memories we hadn't quite figured out how to talk about, but after months of silence, she sent me a letter. Handwritten, full of unexpected insight. "I've started therapy," she wrote, "trying to figure out why I've spent my life comparing myself to you, taking what's yours. I used to think you were the lucky one, Sam. You were the steady one, the one who got love just by being dependable. I always felt like I had to be exceptional to be seen. I was jealous of that. Now I see neither of us really got what we needed. Not from each other, not from Mom and Dad. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I'm just trying to break the cycle. For Leo's sake." That letter affected me more than I expected. It was the first time Jessica hadn't tried to justify or excuse herself. She simply owned the truth, and that truth cracked something open inside me. 2 weeks later, I visited her and Leo. We sat together on her couch, both wary but willing. Leo was fussy that day, and Jessica passed him to me, frustrated. Maybe he just needs someone stronger today. To both our surprise, He quieted in my arms. I looked down at his tiny face, and for the first time, I didn't see a reminder of betrayal. I saw a new beginning. "You're doing okay," I said. Jessica looked like she might cry. "I'm trying, I really am." Before I left, she asked if I would consider being Leo's godmother. "I want him to have strong, independent women in his life," she said. "Someone like you." I agreed, to my own surprise. Some wounds don't heal the way we expect, but they do heal. My parents had struggled in the wake of it all. At first, they treated Kyle and me like we were going through a typical divorce. It took several difficult conversations before my father acknowledged the damage done, not just by Kyle and Jessica, but by years of subtle favoritism. "We always thought Jessica needed more attention, because she was so reactive," he admitted during dinner one night. "You seemed so self-sufficient. We didn't realize we were hurting you by treating you like you didn't need as much." That admission, while late, felt like the loosening of a knot I hadn't realized was still tightening around my chest. My father's words didn't erase years of imbalance or heal the bruises left by 1,000 small injustices, but they mattered. Because they were honest, and they came from a place that finally seemed to see me not just as the stable one or the default adult in the family, but as a person who had quietly bled beneath the surface for decades. After that dinner, our conversations became more real. Fewer polite exchanges about work and weather, and more pauses to ask, "How are you really doing, Sam?" My mother, slower to change, still struggled with discomfort when emotions got messy, but even she began trying in small, awkward ways, sending me articles on resilience, forwarding quotes about strength and healing. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I found myself visiting Jessica and Leo more frequently, not out of obligation, but curiosity. She had transformed in subtle ways, less brash, more introspective. She didn't pretend things were normal. She didn't ask for my forgiveness again, which made it easier to inch towards something resembling sisterhood. We would sit on her couch with Leo, nestled between us, and she would tell me how exhausting and wonderful motherhood was. One afternoon, Leo fussed endlessly, no pacifier or lullaby soothing him. Jessica handed him to me, defeated. Maybe he just needs someone stronger today, and to our shared surprise, he quieted in my arms. I looked down at his small, sleepy face, and then up at my sister. "You're doing okay," I said. Jessica blinked back sudden tears. "I'm trying, I really am." And I believed her. At work, I finally accepted David's invitation to join the group for drinks. It was nothing special, just a few coworkers at a dimly lit pub laughing over fries and happy hour specials, but it reminded me that life existed outside the confines of pain, that joy could be simple, unremarkable, and still real. David walked me to my car afterward and didn't push when I said goodnight. He just smiled and said, "It's good to see you smile again, Sam." Weeks turned into months, and the sharp edges of betrayal dulled into quiet lessons. I learned that boundaries are love turned inward, that strength isn't about never breaking, but knowing how to put yourself back together, and that sometimes growth begins not in forgiveness, but in the firm declaration, "This will not happen to me again." I bought a small potted tree for my apartment balcony in the spring. Symbolic maybe, but intentional. I watered it every morning, watched new leaves unfurl with the sunlight. It became a ritual, a reminder that life grows on, even from the most scorched earth. It wasn't a complete reckoning, but it was a start. All of us, my parents, Jessica, and I, were slowly learning how to build healthier relationships from the ruins of what used to be. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but the process had begun. I was no longer the silent sibling, silently swallowing disappointment. And they were no longer pretending everything was fine. That counted for something. In the past year, I'd poured my energy into my career and watched it flourish. The promotion I received wasn't just a title, it was a symbol of how far I'd come. I now managed a dynamic marketing team, which included David, whose quiet support had become one of the most dependable parts of my life. His calm presence, dry humor, and patience had helped me navigate some of my darkest days. What started as a professional bond became a friendship, and from there, something warmer. We weren't rushing into anything, both of us carried scars, but we understood each other in ways that didn't need many words. Kyle had moved to Denver not long after our divorce, a new job, a new city, and, from what I'd heard through mutual friends, a new girlfriend. His exit from Chicago had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I no longer had to worry about seeing him at the grocery store or bumping into him at a mutual acquaintance's wedding. Jessica told me he almost never asked about Leo. There was something oddly fitting about that. He had no biological link to the child, and his behavior reflected it. In contrast, I had discovered reservoirs of strength I hadn't known existed. That woman, me, who sat at a birthday dinner with her life unraveling around her and still calmly ate cake? She didn't vanish after the betrayal. She evolved. I became someone who didn't flinch from confrontation, who could set boundaries without guilt, and who recognized that loving yourself is not vanity, it's survival. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. It was David, arriving to walk me to dinner. It was my birthday, my 33rd. A year had passed since that infamous night, and this time, I was reclaiming the day with people who truly cared. "You look beautiful," David said as I opened the door, his gaze soft and steady. "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched. He handed me a small gift, wrapped neatly. "You didn't have to bring anything," I told him. "It's nothing big, just something I thought you'd like." Inside the box was a leather-bound journal. On the first page, in his handwriting, was a quote. "The most beautiful people are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths." Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I traced the words with my fingertips. "It's perfect," I whispered. The restaurant was warm and inviting. Candlelight danced across the tables, the hum of conversation filling the space without overwhelming it. As we stepped inside, I was greeted with a chorus of cheers from my closest friends. Megan, who had taken me in during the worst of it, Carla, who had brought me soup and distractions, and even James from HR, who had bent the rules to give me space when I needed it. They weren't here out of obligation. They had stood by me because they wanted to, and that made all the difference. The evening was full of laughter, shared stories, and the kind of effortless connection I used to think only happened in movies. When the waiter brought out a surprise dessert platter, sparklers and all, I laughed until I cried. 1 year ago, my birthday had ended in betrayal. Tonight, it ended in joy. As the night wound down, David walked me home. The streets were quiet, the pavement glistening from a recent rain. "Do you feel different?" he asked as we neared my building. I considered the question. "Yeah, I do. I feel whole, not perfect, but whole, like I finally know who I am, even with the broken parts." He smiled and brushed a stray hair behind my ear. "You didn't let what happened define you." "You helped," I said. "Maybe," he shrugged, "but you did the heavy lifting." Inside my apartment, I placed the journal on my nightstand. The quote echoed in my head as I got ready for bed. I had known struggle, I had known loss, but now I also knew what it meant to rebuild. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, I had reclaimed something that once felt ruined. My birthday, my identity, my peace, and I was finally ready to live on my own terms.